Hello, this is the Demographics Decoded podcast with me, demographer Simon Küstenmacher.
And me, Michael Yardney, property and wealth creation expert. And this is the podcast where we unveil the trends shaping our futures. Now, today we're going to tackle let me call it a hot topic that affects us all, and that's actually climate change. But we're not just going to discuss the weather. I want to explore with Simon how different generations perceive and react to climate issues and what it means to us. Simon, you wrote about this in your regular column in the New Daily a little while ago.
Yeah, because I felt like it's worth tackling this from not a scientific perspective in a sense of like, what is the physical logic behind climate change? We're more interested into the human aspect here. What do different people, groups of people think of, and how does climate change affect different people, different groups of people?
Okay, so we're not here to be experts on climate change, but we do understand, and you understand a bit about demographics. And in your article, you explained how baby boomers look at it differently to Gen Zs, how Gen Xs look at it differently as well. It seems each group has got its own unique take. I guess that's based on their experiences and the times they've lived through.
Exactly. It's based on what they lived through so far. It is about their main pain points in time right now. And it's just a different focus that you might be under. And of course, all of this happens under big societal shifts as well. And what I always tell my friends in the environmental space is that we better make sure that Australia remains a rich country, because we do see once you have more economic immediate struggles, you put any kind of climate change related concerns to the back. So you're really not pushing for the most environmentally friendly solution if you're most worried about paying rent and putting food on the table. So becoming green, so to speak, first means that you have enough greens in the wallet, so to speak.
That makes sense, so that you're worried about your day-to-day rather than the future. But maybe we could go through how the different generations view it. My sense from where I sit is that boomers haven't been as concerned about it as younger generations.
Yeah, not at the big major global warming type narrative. And it's also want to counter the okay boomer kind of narrative where we say, it's just people that say, I only got 20 years to live. What the hell do I care? Let them burn after me. I think that's naive and it's unjust to a generation that did clean up the local environment significantly. So we have seen many areas where under the management of baby boomers, we did reforest, we did ensure that we have cleaner rivers after the initial pollution from the 70s, up to the 70s and 80s. So there was a lot of positive environmental movements that came out of the baby boomer cohort, something like the Bob Brown green agenda, the pure environmentalist green agenda. That is a baby boomer movement. So
Baby boomers, when we started, there wasn't recycling even. You used to throw cigarettes, I never smoked, out your window when people were driving. There has been, for boomers, quite a significant change in looking at the environment. But as you say, it was more the local environment.
Exactly. And we now understand more and more because we gained more and more complex knowledge about the changing of the environment in the scientific community. So we now know this. That's cool. And now we need to act on this. So unfortunately, though, we kind of create a bit of a intergenerational conflict in there as well. And to a degree that is necessary and obvious, because young people have to live with negative consequences for longer than older people. That's just pure logic. But it's not enough, is it? Because ultimately, older people are interested in leaving a legacy, and you can't discount that. Nobody actually says things like, I'm happy to ruin the planet because I am soon gone. That's not a thing. So please, let's not take this too serious, these kind of simplifications.
Okay, so boomers are concerned, but I've come across a number of younger people who are very concerned. In fact, one of my nephews is a psychologist, and his specialty is actually helping people who have got environment and climate change anxiety.
Yeah.
In fact, he was paid by the local government to go to various areas and help people with that. I didn't realize how big a challenge it is for some people.
It's very big. And we spoke about this a bit when we talked about Gen Zs in particular
Yes.
on our generational series. So these young people grew up with smartphones in their hands as soon as they hit their formative years in the early teenage years. And that means they were constantly bombarded with those global news stories, and climate change is one of them. And this is literally an end of the world type narrative that you're constantly being exposed to. And that does shape your worldview, and it will very much make you feel bad about the status quo and the future prospect of this world. And it's probably rather similar to the angst that people experienced during the height of the Cold War, where the nuclear war was imminent. So you also
Yes.
felt very, very bad about that. And it's just that we didn't have as many psychologists in the system back then that could have actually diagnosed the nuclear anxiety. But if you do any kind of reading about the 80s, you know how severe this must have been in big cohorts of society. And it remains to be seen how we dealt with it. Well, we dealt with it then and how we deal with it now. If I look at the nuclear narrative, we created heaps and heaps of movies and books afterwards that imagined a post-nuclear world. And I think this was some
Yes.
sort of way of dealing with this. This is like, yeah, well, this is a crazy post-nuke world, and somehow we are still fine. Somehow the good of humanity will still prevail in these kind of societies. We haven't done this quite yet with the environmental space, where we imagine a world that is completely hot, and we then kind of get by with it. You could say Mad Max, you could put into this category or something like this. But maybe there is a bit more on the arts and culture that we could do to collectively deal with these kind of changes. But in the meantime, it's just one more news story, so to speak, that creates angst in a generation. And it's also something that you cannot immediately do something against, quite like the nuclear threat. Yes, you can recycle. Cool. Yes, if you have the means, you can buy an electric vehicle rather than a petrol vehicle. You can put solar on your roof. You can live a low carbon lifestyle. But you know that you are one of 8 billion people. And how much will this make a difference? So it's probably that it's a situation where the negative consequence is outside of your control. And so you just need to suffer it, or you need to accept that this is coming. And I would argue that is probably the more helpful piece of advice to young people, is to say, well, the most likely scenario is that the climate continues to change, that ultimately we continue to live with more extreme severe weather events in our future, and probably rising temperatures in most parts of the globe.
Well, I want to follow that train of thought for a sec, Simon, but if I may, I want to put a shameless plug in because you mentioned our generational series a minute ago in your discussion, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but I know we have thousands of new listeners and viewers to this every week as we publish this Demographics Decoded podcast every week. And around Christmas time, Simon and I did a series on the various generational groups, starting with the baby boomers and finishing with the younger generation. And it was enlightening to me, but it was also clearly, Simon, very popular because of how many people watched it, viewed it, listened to it, and forwarded it on. So if you don't currently subscribe to this channel, wherever you do it, watching this, Spotify, YouTube, Apple, whatever, subscribe so you get these weekly sessions with Simon and me. But then when you got some time, go back, because that was fascinating. And that's very useful, to understand how you are reacting differently to your boss, your employers, your employees, your parents or your children. It gave me some great insights. Sorry to stop the discussion about the climate change for a sec, Simon, but it just reminded me how good that series that you did was. So just back to this then, if the younger generation are feeling a stronger sense of urgency regarding climate change, and that's clearly obvious, how does it translate into their life choices? Does it make a difference to their career paths, their family planning, where they choose to live?
Yeah, so we already see changes in family planning. We see at least more people claiming that one of the reasons they choose to have fewer or no kids is global warming.
Really?
Yeah, they say it's sometimes you go as far as saying it would be cruel to put a kid in a world that is slowly coming to an end. You would say, and this is a what I would call a carbon reductionistic view, where we say a kid is just another carbon producing machine that makes global warming worse, so it's better not to have kids. That is a popular narrative in sort of like the most extreme end of the spectrum. And of course, if this is your worldview, you're not going to add kids. If your main worldview of humans is just a carbon emitting cancer on the planet, yes, you're right in not making more of those. Is this doing justice to the complexity of a human existence? I would argue not, but this
Yes.
remains a individual decision, so people will continue to make this decision. As a demographer, I of course more look at the big picture demographic trends globally, where we see that mankind is shrinking in about 40, 50, 60 years, depending on who you listen to. And so we say, well, ultimately we'll be fine there. It's just a matter of getting used to working with these changing realities. And my advice always to young people that are very concerned about the climate is you need to become an engineer. That is the sole profession that will solve climate change. All kind of political climate change activism and so forth, all of these things will play second fiddle to engineering. We're going to engineer our way out of this simply by producing a zero emission economy. And in order to do this, you need to make sure that renewable energies in whatever way are the cheapest and the most reliable source of energy on this planet. Once you achieve this, the rest will follow automatically. And all the other stuff, I'm quite serious about this, is only a sideshow. And ultimately, if you want to make the most use of your intellectual time of this planet and global warming is your biggest concern, it should be a route down the academic and engineering pathway.
Now, I find it interesting. I've got your article open here, and you mentioned about the various generations, and you wrote cleverly that there are generational elements to climate change. Naive, poorly informed young folk want to save the planet and moralise and shame ignorant, profit-hungry, poorly informed older folk who don't give a damn about the planet's future as long as they got nice retirement. I
Yeah.
think it's a little bit more complicated than that.
Exactly. It is more complicated than that, but it's also always very tempting to create simple demographic kind of war stories. It makes for good media. It makes for an easy blame game, but there's more to it than that. But sometimes your anger about certain kind of intergenerational wealth differences and the general mismanagement of the global environment, if you will, it just feels good to let go and just to find a bit of an enemy. That's fine. But ultimately we do need to remember that everyone is impacted by climate change. No matter how old or how young you are, if these things occur, and they do occur, you then need to figure out, well, we're all impacted, so let's just deal with the coming changes. So climate change adaptation becomes very, very important. And this is not giving up on making the whole energy system greener, more sustainable. That is still much, much needed.
Given our diverse way we're living in Australia and the diverse regional demographics, how does it impact differently in urban areas compared to rural areas and locations?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, the more urban you are, the less directly impacted you are by climate change. Yes, of course, we had a cyclone hitting a big urban region in southeast Queensland recently. That is most certainly true, but ultimately longer dry spells, longer periods of high temperature, these things are felt more severely in a rural and regional setting. And as long as our cities have enough air-conditioned dwellings and so forth, the impacts in a city are less severe than the impacts in a regional and remote area. And so we do have this kind of comical situation always where we see that the people that are most concerned about climate change or about the environment tend to be the ones less directly impacted by it. So these are inner city elites, as we sometimes call green voting cohorts. They also see the least amount of green on an average day compared to the least concerned about climate change people in regional and remote communities, even though they are more directly impacted by climate
Yes.
change in their harvests, in just the shifting weather patterns. They're much more directly important if you run a dairy farm or if you're interested about the next harvest. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. And when there is such an obvious mismatch, we risk using a technical discussion about climate change as a cultural division in this country. And that's, again, not helping anyone, I would argue.
Well, my interest is property, as you know, and I would be dissuading people from buying properties in areas that are going to, over the next decades, be more prone to climate change because they're going to become uninsurable. Already, insurance in far north Queensland and other parts of Australia has risen more than in the big capital cities, and it's suggested that that a lot of properties in those areas are going to be just too expensive to insure or uninsurable altogether. Do you think that's actually going to make a difference to internal migration patterns, Simon?
Absolutely. Absolutely. We'll have whole areas of Australia sooner or later that are uninsurable. We're talking about areas that just get burned out once or twice, then they get flooded out once or twice in a row. Who's going to insure these areas? And then some Australians will still be stubborn enough to build there and so forth. But ultimately, these climate change affected areas will bleed population like crazy. That is all but guaranteed. And when we talk about property and climate change, we're not just thinking about where we want to live. This is also where do we put our critical infrastructure? Do we ensure that our power plants and so forth, that they are at the safest spots that are not at risk of being burned out or flooded? And you have companies around the world like Climate Alpha, run by Paracana out of Singapore, who help investors all around the world to just figure out what to invest in and what to not invest in. So the financial space is highly tuned into this already. So who are we then to say that this doesn't matter? And it's just smart planning, to be honest. Like you would have never suggested anything like, yo, this area tends to flood occasionally. Let's just put a crucial power station in there. That's not what you do. And so we're now just a bit more aware of this. And just if you ever bored on a Saturday night, have a look at your local council area's website. Quite a few of those websites now have fire or flood maps, interactive maps available. You see this in the Blue Mountains. Look there. They have amazing maps that just says one side of the mountain is essentially fire safe and the other one isn't. So sometimes it's literally just a matter of like 5 meters to either side, and your house is either extremely safe or extremely unsafe.
Simon, it's not just in the Blue Mountains and regional areas. If you look at Queensland or Brisbane in particular, there are flood zones where one would avoid buying. Interestingly, in Melbourne, there's flood overlays over large parts of the beachside areas and lower lying suburbs of Melbourne. They don't have severe floods, but we know that the infrastructure just can't cope. But in Queensland, it's very different again, where we know that the severe storms can cause problems. Now, interestingly, at the time of recording, we are in the throes of an election, and it started off that Peter Dutton did bring up nuclear power, but in fact, the climate change discussion seems not to be a major factor amongst politicians just at present.
No, and we do see that this is not pressing enough. And that's what I mean by we sometimes call this a climate emergency. And while I think this is very, very serious, I think the term emergency is not helping. Simply because an emergency means that this is the most pressing thing right now, but it isn't. Unless you are literally being flooded out of your area, unless you are being running away from a fire, this is not the most pressing area. And so then the most pressing topic is something like cost of living relief. And you see that the current election will be solely based around cost of living. It's the most uninspired budget that we've seen. It's an extremely uninspired election campaign where this is just all about cost of living. The Liberals will just hope that they will get voted in because so far all of the incumbent parties across the world tend to have been kicked out in the last couple of years. So don't expect much there, and don't expect climate change to make a major comeback. The Greens will talk about it, but they only talk to their own constituents. They won't win much additional votes with this narrative. If they focus on rent relief, on I don't know, rental reform, or on something like this, they would go much. They would gain them more votes, so to speak. So I would go as far as saying climate change will not matter at all at the coming election.
Now, if we have a look overseas, some countries have actually managed their climate change pretty well. In your article in the New Daily, which isn't behind a paywall, so I'm going to leave a link to it in the show notes, you mentioned Norway as a good example.
And Norway, in my opinion, is what we should emulate. in Australia, because Norway, of course, is a small country in the north of Europe, and they just happen to have a bit of a sea next to them. And then turns out that they were a poor country for a long while, just doing a bit of fishing, and that's it. And then they discovered bucket loads of oil and gas in the ocean. They captured this wealth. This is all done by state-owned companies, essentially. They captured this wealth. They tax it like crazy. They throw all the money into a national sovereign wealth fund. And then so far they use this fund to just green the economy, to green the energy system. This is a net zero economy now, even though they are making money with dirty, evil, polluting energy sources. But
They're using it for good.
yeah, they're using it.
It's
They
a bit like Robin Hood. You rob from the rich and give to the poor.
Yeah, but that's exactly what I think we should be doing. Do I think that Australia should eventually, once it is financially feasible, stop burning coal, for example? Absolutely. Coal is a transition energy source that does need to be phased out in Australia and in the global system. And so if you look back at the last 200 years time, 200 years time, so from now until 200 years into the future, you will see that coal will have been phased out, and people go like, this was a temporary energy source that we used for a little bit. But in order to do this, you need to invest into green, sustainable energies, and we should be doing this. We should be a country that is extremely pro-mining, coal, for example, and then selling this to the rest of the world, make a bucket load of money in the process, capture this wealth. At the moment, we're doing a poor job in taxing our mining exports, so we need to earn more tax on this. This tax does not need to be wasted on whatever. It does need to have a specific purpose to make Australia a net zero energy country. And then we also need to make sure that we invest into the future technologies and become a bit of a leader in this field as well. That should do us good. But you see how this is politically unattractive, because the Greens can say, this is just madness. Mining is bad, evil. And the mining people go like, dude, this green energy stuff, that's a bit softy. That's not cutting the mustard. So it's a real vote pleaser for exactly no one. So we haven't found a political way of dealing this. To literally think about how can we mine as much as possible, because this is our main export, what we offer to the world in Australia, and how can we then utilize it to the best good in Australia. And I'm quite serious about a tax reform in mining. And I'd say if I look at global energy sources, if I look at global rare earths and so forth, we have these things on offer and there will be demand for it. So we do not need to be intimidated by big global corporations that say we won't be paying tax, we'll go elsewhere. You won't go elsewhere. We are one of the few stable democracies that have bucket load of stuff in the ground. We'll be very attractive from a supply chain sovereignty perspective. So Australia could be doing more there. Yet again, proving that we are the lucky country who is actually getting the most out of this, even in a difficult situation where the global climate keeps changing, it keeps warming.
Now, I want to just take a moment out from my session with Simon today to remind you that Simon Kirstenmacher is going to be the keynote speaker at Wealth Retreat on the Gold Coast on the 3rd to the 7th of May. Now, once a year we get together with a small group of already successful business people, entrepreneurs and investors. And Wealth Retreat's not a property seminar. Wealth Retreat is really, the theme of Wealth Retreat is where are you going to be in 2030, in May 2030, in 5 years' time, in all areas of your life. So it's a holistic seminar. Now, we spend a lot of time talking about property and about tax and about finance, and Simon's going to talk about the future. But I suggest that you go to wealthretreat.com.au and find out about it. But please don't count yourself out. The successes we've seen from people who've come to previous Wealth Retreats has been amazing, because you go in with a whole lot of ideas and plans for the next 5 years, but you go out with a structured plan rather than just ideas. And then I always have a one-on-one implementation session with people afterwards to make sure that they implement that plan. But we've got an amazing faculty of property, tax, business, finance, development and demographic faculty, the best faculty I could put together, and it's an intensive 5 days, but everything's included, including a lot of one-on-one time with the experts, but more than that, building a community. A lot of people that are listening to this, watching this, feel that they're a bit isolated. So the aim of Wealth Retreat is to build a community which we help keep together so that you can talk to others about your successes and failures in business, in property, in money, in entrepreneurship. wealthretreat.com.au. I invite you to join us on the Gold Coast in the beginning of May. Well, Simon, I know in your day-to-day role you advise policymakers, you advise governments at different levels, you advise institutions and organisations. And if people want to have a chat with you or your team about how you can provide a presentation for them, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes to the demographics group, and they can have a talk with Fiona and your team about how you can help them. But you already gave me some advice a moment ago about what you're telling policymakers. But if you could get them to listen, what else would you tell policymakers about how to effectively communicate the risks of climate change and maybe come up with some solutions?
Yeah, the first thing is a very honest long-term look at what the future holds. And the future holds more warming. So we then need to act accordingly. So any kind of transition towards a clean energy future seems very, very plausible to me. In order to make this feasible, we need to find a way to improve technology rather sooner than later. So that means more engineers that dedicate their careers to this field. This means more investment in this field. And in order to make the money available that we need for these investments, our way out actually is mining, which seems counterintuitive for people. I say, keep this away. When you think about Australian coal, yes, coal is an evil polluting energy source. But what would happen to the world if we stopped mining Australian coal tomorrow? We would see immediately coal prices go up. This would immediately lead to brown coal reserves, the dirtiest coal reserves across the world, become financially viable again. So all of a sudden in Germany, we would mine brown coal again, which would do the exact opposite of helping the planet. So it's bizarre, it's counterintuitive, but I'm absolutely convinced that stopping Australian coal, as long as there is some sort of coal being burnt around the world, would do more harm than good for the environment, and all the while we would cheat our way out of nice tax revenue source. So we shouldn't do this. So there is a way where being too moralistic actually hinders us. So I want leaders to be pragmatic and long-term in their decision making. And quite often I see neither of those two, which is when I get depressed.
Interesting. So it's not going to go away, and there will be the Greta Thunbergs and the Greens and others who make a big fuss about this, but it does have to become part of our decisions as citizens of Australia, citizens of the world, and business people as well. So I look forward to having a chat with you about this over the years. But next week, we're going to talk about something a little bit different. If you don't currently subscribe to Demographics Decoded, I suggest you click the follow button, because next week, Simon, I want to talk about one of your other articles, looking back over the last 60 years about how Australia has changed, what we can learn from that so we can look in the future, which is really what the topic of these podcasts are. Demographics Decoded, unveiling the trends to our future is really what we're talking about.
That's all we do. And next week we'll do this by just looking at the long-term unemployment rate over the last 60 years. And we'll see what kind of stories that will help us unearth.
Look forward to our chat next week. Thanks, Simon.
See you next week.
This Demographics Decoded podcast has been brought to you by Metropole Property Strategists. We provide a complete range of services to help our clients safely create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you're looking to buy an investment property or your next home, why not have a discovery chat with one of our wealth strategists? Just go to metropole.com.au and explore your options. You'll find we're much more than just another buyer's agent. We provide a complete range of services, including property advisory, wealth advisory, home buying, buyer's agency, property management, renovations, and development management services. The team at Metropole will help you with frameworks that I've fine-tuned over 5 decades, and we've been helping clients with for well over 25 years. We're big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. In between these Demographics Decoded shows, you can follow me on social media, and I suggest you also follow Simon Kirstenmacher. You'll find him regularly posting on all social media platforms. And thanks for spending the last little while with Simon and me. I hope you got some benefit from the show. And if you did, and you know somebody who may also benefit, please tell them about Demographics Decoded. There's a share button on every podcast app. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you're definitely going to be doing us a favour, helping us in our quest to make as many people as possible aware of the demographic changes that are going to be shaping their future. And of course, if you don't currently subscribe, we'd love you to. And of course, any of the information that we've been sharing with you is general information because we don't know your specific circumstances.